I am Haley Torres, 28 years old, and I thought joining the Army would finally make my mother proud. Growing up in a family where military service was considered the highest honor, I believed that earning my uniform would bridge the emotional distance that had always existed between us. What I never expected was that the moment I needed her most, bleeding and broken in a hospital bed, she would choose military protocol over maternal instinct. When those words left her lips as I fought for my life, something inside me shattered beyond repair. But what happened next exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of my unit and proved that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on foreign soil, but within the walls of your own family. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The Torres family legacy was written in blood, sweat, and unwavering loyalty to the United States Armed Forces. My grandfather, Miguel Torres, had stormed the beaches of Normandy during World War II, returning home with a Purple Heart and stories that became family legend. My father, Colonel Marcus Torres, followed in those footsteps, serving 3 tours in Vietnam before transitioning to a distinguished career training new recruits at Fort Braxton in North Carolina. But it was my mother, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Torres, who truly embodied the military mindset in our household. She had broken barriers as one of the first women to serve in combat roles during the Gulf War, earning commendations for her tactical brilliance and uncompromising dedication to duty. Her military bearing never left her, even in civilian clothes. Our family dinners felt like briefings. Our household rules resembled standard operating procedures, and emotional displays were treated as signs of weakness. I grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in a modest ranch house just outside the base gates. The walls were lined with military portraits, commendations, and folded flags from fallen comrades. Every morning began with the national anthem playing on our kitchen radio, and every evening ended with my mother inspecting my room for military precision. My older brother, Staff Sergeant David Torres, had naturally fallen into line, enlisting immediately after high school and currently serving with the 82nd Airborne Division. My younger sister, Rebecca, was already making plans for West Point despite being only 16. Then there was me, the middle child who struggled to fit the Torres military mold. Throughout high school, I excelled academically but showed little interest in ROTC or military preparation programs. I preferred art classes to tactical exercises, creative writing to military history. My mother viewed these interests with barely concealed disappointment, often remarking that I was too soft for the Torres legacy. The pressure intensified after graduation when I announced my intention to study graphic design at the University of North Carolina. My mother's reaction was swift and devastating. She informed me that if I chose frivolous pursuits over military service, I would receive no financial support and would be considered a disappointment to 3 generations of Torres warriors. My father, ever loyal to my mother's judgment, supported her ultimatum without question. Faced with crushing student debt and family rejection, I made the decision that would change everything. 3 weeks before my 19th birthday, I walked into the Army recruitment office in downtown Fayetteville and enlisted as a combat medic. The pride in my mother's eyes when I told her was the first genuine warmth I had received from her in years. For the first time in my life, I felt like I might actually belong in the Torres family. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri was brutal, but I threw myself into every challenge with desperate determination to prove myself worthy of the Torres name. My drill sergeants quickly identified my medical aptitude and leadership potential. Despite my initial reluctance about military life, I discovered I had a natural talent for battlefield medicine and tactical decision-making. I graduated in the top 10% of my class, earning the respect of my peers and the grudging approval of my instructors. My advanced individual training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas further solidified my capabilities as a combat medic. I excelled in trauma care, field surgery, and medical evacuation procedures. My instructors noted my ability to remain calm under extreme pressure and make critical medical decisions in simulated combat environments. For the first time since childhood, I felt genuinely confident in my abilities and excited about my future. The letters from home during training told a story of family transformation. My mother's communications, typically brief and formal, became longer and more personal. She shared stories about her own early military experiences and expressed pride in my progress. My father sent care packages with handwritten notes about Torres family military traditions. Even David, usually too busy with his own service commitments, found time to write encouraging messages about following in the family footsteps. When I completed my training and received orders for deployment to Afghanistan with the 3rd Infantry Division, the homecoming celebration was everything I had dreamed of as a child. My mother organized a family gathering where she presented me with her own Purple Heart Medal, a gesture so unexpected and meaningful that I broke down in tears. She held me that night, something she hadn't done since I was very young, and whispered that she had never been prouder of anyone in her entire life. The deployment to Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan began routinely enough. Our medical unit was attached to a company responsible for training Afghan National Army soldiers and conducting joint patrol operations in Kunar province. The base was relatively secure, but the surrounding area remained contested territory where improvised explosive devices and small arms attacks were constant threats. My first months in country passed without a major incident. I treated everything from minor injuries and illnesses to more serious combat wounds from soldiers returning from patrol operations. My commanding officer, Captain Robert Chen, quickly recognized my competence and began assigning me to more complex medical cases. I worked closely with Dr. Amanda Foster, a civilian contractor who had been embedded with our unit to provide advanced trauma care capabilities. The team dynamics were generally positive, though I noticed some tension between the enlisted medics and certain NCOs. Staff Sergeant Kevin Murphy, our senior medic, had a reputation for cutting corners on equipment maintenance and medical supply accountability. Sergeant First Class Brian Walsh, who supervised our medical evacuation procedures, often seemed more concerned with paperwork efficiency than patient care protocols. These concerns felt minor compared to the satisfaction I felt in my work and the pride my family expressed in my service. My mother's weekly emails became highlights of my deployment, filled with updates about base activities and expressions of admiration for my dedication. She had begun sharing stories about my service with her military colleagues, something that would have been unthinkable during my high school years. 6 months into the deployment, our unit received intelligence about increased enemy activity in a nearby valley where a key Afghan National Army outpost had lost radio contact. Captain Chen assigned our medical team to accompany a joint patrol operation designed to assess the situation and provide medical support if needed. The mission briefing indicated moderate risk levels with standard precautionary measures. The patrol convoy consisted of 4 armored vehicles carrying 24 American soldiers and 12 Afghan National Army personnel. Our medical team occupied the 3rd vehicle, positioned to provide rapid response capability while maintaining relative security. I had participated in dozens of similar missions, and this one felt routine as we departed the base early on a crisp October morning. The first indication of trouble came approximately 2 hours into the patrol when our lead vehicle reported possible IED indicators along the planned route. The convoy halted while explosive ordnance disposal specialists moved forward to investigate. We waited in our vehicles for nearly 40 minutes before receiving clearance to proceed along an alternate route that would add 30 minutes to our travel time. The alternate route took us through more challenging terrain with limited visibility and fewer escape options if we encountered enemy contact. As we navigated a particularly narrow mountain pass, our vehicle's radio crackled with urgent communications from the lead element. They had identified fresh tire tracks and disturbed earth that suggested recent enemy activity in the area. Captain Chen made the decision to continue the mission rather than abort and return to base. His reasoning was sound. The Afghan outpost needed immediate assessment, and our intelligence suggested that enemy forces in the area were small and poorly equipped. None of us questioned his judgment, though I noticed increased tension among the soldiers as we pressed deeper into potentially hostile territory. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The explosion happened so suddenly that my first sensation was not sound or pain, but the strange feeling of weightlessness as our vehicle lifted off the ground. The improvised explosive device had been expertly concealed beneath the road surface, positioned to detonate under the heaviest part of our armored vehicle. The blast was powerful enough to flip our 7-ton vehicle completely over, sending it tumbling down a steep embankment before coming to rest against a cluster of boulders. When consciousness returned, I found myself trapped beneath twisted metal and medical equipment, warm liquid flowing down my face and chest. The metallic taste in my mouth told me it was blood, though I couldn't immediately determine the source or severity of my injuries. Around me, I could hear moaning and calls for help from other survivors, but the overturned vehicle's cramped interior made assessment and movement nearly impossible. My training kicked in despite the pain and disorientation. I began conducting a mental inventory of my injuries while simultaneously trying to assess the condition of my fellow soldiers. Sharp pain in my left leg suggested a possible fracture, and the warm sensation spreading across my torso indicated significant bleeding from an unknown source. Most concerning was the intermittent dizziness that suggested possible head trauma or severe blood loss. The rescue operation took over 3 hours to extract all survivors from the wreckage. By the time I reached the field hospital at Bagram Air Base, I had lost significant blood and was drifting in and out of consciousness. The trauma team immediately began emergency procedures to stabilize my condition, identifying multiple injuries, including a compound fracture of my left femur, deep lacerations across my chest and abdomen, and a severe concussion. What should have been the beginning of my recovery became the moment that shattered everything I believed about family, duty, and unconditional love. The first face I saw when I regained consciousness was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the head trauma surgeon at Bagram's medical facility. Her expression was carefully neutral, the kind of professional mask that medical personnel wear when delivering difficult news. Through the haze of pain medication, I could see the concern in her eyes as she explained the extent of my injuries. The compound fracture in my left leg had required immediate surgical intervention to prevent permanent damage. 3 major lacerations across my chest and abdomen had been sutured, but one had come dangerously close to severing a major artery. The concussion was severe enough to cause memory gaps and cognitive confusion that might persist for weeks. Most troubling was the internal bleeding they had discovered during surgery, damage to my spleen that would require careful monitoring and possible additional procedures. Dr. Mitchell's prognosis was cautiously optimistic. With proper treatment and rehabilitation, I could expect to make a full recovery, though the process would take several months and would likely end my active duty career. The Purple Heart was a certainty, she mentioned almost casually, as if military decorations were standard medical prescriptions. The news of my injuries had traveled quickly through military channels. Captain Chen visited twice during my first week of recovery, expressing genuine concern and providing updates about the other soldiers involved in the incident. 3 members of our team had been killed instantly in the explosion, while 4 others had sustained injuries ranging from minor to critical. The investigation into the attack was ongoing, but preliminary reports suggested sophisticated enemy planning and possible intelligence leaks about our patrol route. What struck me most during those early days was the outpouring of support from my unit and fellow soldiers throughout the base. My hospital room filled with cards, care packages, and visits from people I barely knew who had heard about the attack. The military community's response reminded me why I had ultimately embraced my service despite my initial reluctance. The call from home came on my 4th day in the hospital. I had been expecting it since the casualty notification had been sent to my family, but seeing my mother's contact information on the phone display still made my heart race. Despite everything that had happened, despite the pain and uncertainty about my future, I felt a surge of anticipation at the thought of hearing her voice. The conversation began exactly as I had hoped. My mother's voice carried genuine emotion as she expressed relief that I was alive and concern about my injuries. She asked detailed questions about my medical treatment and prognosis, sounding every bit like the caring parent I had always wanted her to be. For several minutes, we talked like a normal mother and daughter, with her sharing updates about family activities and expressing pride in my service and sacrifice. The shift in tone was subtle at first. My mother began discussing the practical considerations of my situation, questions about my medical leave duration, disability evaluations, and future assignment possibilities. Her voice gradually returned to the familiar military bearing that had defined our relationship throughout my childhood. I sensed she was building towards something, but the pain medication made it difficult to follow her logic completely. When the emotional breakdown hit, it came without warning. I had been describing the moments after the explosion, trying to help her understand how terrifying and painful the experience had been. The words poured out of me, my fear of dying alone, the helplessness of being trapped in the wreckage, the overwhelming pain that made every breath a struggle. For the first time since childhood, I found myself crying openly while talking to my mother. Her response cut through me like a blade. The line went silent for several seconds before she spoke, her voice cold and clinical. "Haley, you need to compose yourself. Soldiers don't cry, especially not Taurus soldiers. You're representing our family and our military tradition. This kind of emotional display reflects poorly on your training and your character." The words hit me harder than the explosion had. Here I was, lying in a hospital bed with multiple injuries sustained while serving my country, and my mother's primary concern was my emotional composure. I tried to explain that I wasn't crying from weakness, but from the trauma of nearly dying, but she cut me off mid-sentence. "I've seen plenty of wounded soldiers over the years, Haley. The strong ones focus on recovery and getting back to duty. The weak ones wallow in self-pity and make excuses. Which kind of soldier are you going to be?" The conversation ended shortly after, with my mother promising to call again once I had regained my military bearing. I hung up the phone feeling more isolated and confused than I had since the explosion. The physical pain was manageable with medication, but this emotional wound felt somehow deeper and more permanent. Dr. Mitchell found me that evening, staring out the window at the mountains surrounding Bagram. She had obviously noticed my change in demeanor since the phone call home, and her gentle questioning eventually drew out the full story. Her reaction was immediate and supportive, validating my feelings and assuring me that emotional responses to trauma were not only normal but healthy. "Your mother's perspective comes from a different generation of military culture," she explained, "but current understanding of combat stress and trauma recovery recognizes that emotional processing is essential for healing. There's nothing weak about acknowledging what you've been through." The days that followed brought a steady stream of visitors and well-wishers, but the absence of further contact from my family became increasingly noticeable. My father sent a brief email expressing relief at my survival, but made no mention of wanting to talk. David was deployed in a remote location with limited communication access, but even his typically reliable messages had stopped coming. Most painful was the silence from Rebecca. Throughout my deployment, my younger sister had been my most faithful correspondent, sending weekly letters filled with high school news and plans for her own military career. Her sudden lack of communication felt like another betrayal, suggesting that my mother's assessment of my weakness had been shared with the entire family. The investigation into our convoy attack began to take on disturbing dimensions during my second week of recovery. Captain Chen visited with news that made my blood run cold. The preliminary findings suggested that our patrol route had been compromised before we left the base. Someone with access to our mission planning had leaked information to enemy forces, allowing them to position the IED with deadly precision. Even more troubling was the discovery of missing medical supplies from our unit's inventory. Items that should have been available for emergency treatment during the attack were nowhere to be found when the rescue team searched our destroyed vehicle. Staff Sergeant Murphy's equipment logs showed discrepancies dating back several months, raising questions about supply chain security and accountability. The implications were staggering. If the investigation's preliminary findings were accurate, the attack that had nearly killed me and had claimed the lives of 3 fellow soldiers might have been preventable. Someone within our own unit had potentially been selling information and supplies to enemy forces, directly contributing to the success of the attack. Captain Chen was careful not to make accusations, but his questions about my observations regarding unit leadership and supply procedures made it clear that the investigation was focusing on personnel with access to sensitive information. He asked specifically about my interactions with Staff Sergeant Murphy and Sergeant First Class Walsh, wanting to know if I had noticed any unusual behavior or conversations. As I reflected on the months leading up to the attack, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Murphy's frequent trips to the Afghan side of the base, ostensibly for equipment maintenance and liaison activities, Walsh's unusual interest in patrol schedules and route planning, despite his role being limited to medical evacuation coordination. Small inconsistencies in medical supply accountability that I had dismissed as administrative errors. The possibility that my injuries and my fellow soldiers' deaths might have resulted from betrayal within our own ranks was almost too overwhelming to process. Combined with my family's reaction to my emotional state, I felt surrounded by people who had failed to protect and support me when I needed them most. Dr. Mitchell recommended that I speak with a military chaplain and a trauma counselor, both of whom were available on base. The conversations helped somewhat, providing professional perspectives on both my family situation and the emerging investigation. But the fundamental questions remained unanswered. How could my mother prioritize military image over maternal compassion? And how could soldiers I had trusted with my life potentially be responsible for endangering it? The answers to both questions would prove more complex and disturbing than I could have imagined. As my physical recovery progressed and the investigation deepened, I began to understand that the explosion in Afghanistan had been just the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would challenge everything I believed about loyalty, family, and the true meaning of military service. The breakthrough in the investigation came from an unexpected source. Specialist Jordan Price, a communications technician who had been monitoring radio traffic on the day of our attack, approached me during my third week of recovery with information that would change everything. Jordan was nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder as he spoke, clearly aware that what he was sharing could have serious consequences. According to Jordan, he had been conducting routine signal intelligence gathering when he intercepted unusual radio communications between our base and unidentified external sources. The transmissions had occurred just hours before our patrol departed, containing specific details about our route, timing, and vehicle configurations. What made the discovery particularly damning was that the communications had originated from within the medical unit's administrative offices. Jordan had initially assumed the transmissions were part of standard coordination with Afghan National Army forces or other coalition units. However, when he attempted to verify the communications through proper channels, he was told by Staff Sergeant Murphy to delete the records and forget what he had heard. Murphy had claimed the transmissions were part of a classified intelligence operation that Jordan wasn't clear to know about. The young specialist had complied at the time, but the attack on our convoy had made him reconsider. He had secretly retained copies of the intercepted transmissions and had been struggling with whether to come forward. My injuries and the deaths of our teammates had finally convinced him that the potential consequences of speaking up were worth the risk. As Jordan shared the technical details of what he had discovered, the scope of the betrayal became clear. The communications weren't random intelligence leaks. They represented a systematic pattern of information sharing that had been ongoing for months. Someone within our unit had been providing detailed operational information to hostile forces in exchange for what appeared to be substantial financial compensation. The evidence Jordan presented was technical and complex, involving radio frequencies, encryption protocols, and communication timestamps that would require expert analysis to fully understand. However, even my limited understanding of military communications made it obvious that this was far more sophisticated than a simple security breach. This was organized treachery at the highest levels of our unit. Jordan's revelation forced me to confront a disturbing possibility. If the investigation revealed systematic corruption within our medical unit, it would likely result in criminal charges, court-martial proceedings, and massive disruption to ongoing operations. The military justice system would demand accountability, but it would also seek to minimize public embarrassment and maintain operational security. Individual soldiers like Jordan and me could easily become collateral damage in a larger political calculation. The weight of this responsibility was crushing. My physical injuries were healing, but the emotional burden of possessing information that could destroy careers and potentially save lives was almost unbearable. I found myself questioning everything: my loyalty to the military, my faith in the chain of command, and my understanding of what constituted honorable service. My internal struggle intensified when I received an unexpected visit from Major Lisa Hamilton, a criminal investigation division officer who had been assigned to lead the formal inquiry into our unit's activities. Major Hamilton was professionally courteous but clearly focused on gathering information rather than providing comfort. Her questions were precise and probing, designed to assess both what I knew and how willing I was to cooperate with the investigation. During our conversation, Major Hamilton revealed that the investigation had expanded beyond simple security breaches. Financial irregularities had been discovered in medical supply procurement, suggesting that missing equipment and medications were being sold on black markets. Personnel records showed unusual patterns of leave and travel that couldn't be adequately explained. Most disturbing, communications analysis had identified potential connections to known terrorist organizations and criminal networks. The implications were staggering. Our medical unit, which was supposed to save lives and provide critical care, had potentially been compromised by personnel who were actively working with enemy forces. The very people I had trusted to protect and support our mission had been betraying everything we stood for. Major Hamilton's questions about my family background surprised me. She asked detailed questions about my mother's military career, my father's current position, and my brother's service record. When I asked why this information was relevant, she explained that the investigation had revealed connections between our unit's compromised personnel and other military installations, including Fort Braxton, where my parents were stationed. The possibility that my family might be connected to the corruption scandal was almost too devastating to consider. My mother's harsh reaction to my emotional state suddenly took on new significance. Had she been trying to protect me from something, or was she attempting to distance the Torres family from potential scandal? Was her insistence on the military bearing an expression of genuine concern, or a calculated effort to maintain family reputation? These questions became more urgent when I received a second phone call from home. This time it was my father who contacted me, and his tone was markedly different from my mother's previous conversation. He seemed genuinely concerned about my recovery and expressed appropriate emotional support for what I had endured. However, as the conversation progressed, his questions began focusing on the investigation and what information I had shared with military authorities. My father's inquiries were subtle but persistent. He wanted to know about my interactions with investigators, what questions had been asked, and whether I had observed any unusual activities within my unit before the attack. His interest seemed to go beyond parental concern, suggesting that he had specific knowledge about the investigation's scope and potential implications. When I mentioned Jordan's visit and the communications evidence he had shared, my father's reaction was immediate and alarming. He strongly advised me to avoid getting involved in political matters that were beyond my understanding. He suggested that young soldiers like Jordan might have misinterpreted routine military communications, and that my cooperation with investigators could damage my own career and reputation. Most disturbing was his recommendation that I request an immediate medical transfer to a facility closer to home, where the family could provide proper support during my recovery. The suggestion felt less like parental care and more like an attempt to remove me from the investigation before I could provide damaging testimony. The conversation ended with my father emphasizing the importance of family loyalty and the Torres military legacy. He reminded me that rash decisions and public statements could have consequences that extended far beyond my individual situation. The message was clear. My family's reputation and my own future depended on my discretion and cooperation with family interests rather than military justice. After hanging up, I felt more isolated and confused than ever. The people I had trusted most, my family and my military unit, seemed to be pulling me in directions that conflicted with my understanding of duty and honor. The investigation was revealing corruption that demanded accountability, but pursuing justice could apparently destroy the very institutions and relationships that had defined my entire life. Dr. Mitchell found me that evening in an even worse emotional state than after my mother's previous call. This time, however, I was able to articulate the complexity of my situation. The medical team's response was immediate and protective. They arranged for me to speak with a military lawyer who could explain my rights and obligations regarding the investigation. The legal consultation was enlightening and terrifying. According to the JAG officer, I had both a legal obligation to cooperate with criminal investigations and a right to protection from retaliation or coercion. However, he also explained that military justice proceedings could take years to resolve and that witnesses in high-profile cases often faced significant personal and professional consequences regardless of the eventual outcomes. As my fourth week of recovery began, I faced an impossible choice. I could cooperate fully with the investigation, potentially exposing corruption that had cost lives, but also destroying my family relationships and military career. Alternatively, I could minimize my involvement, protecting my personal interests, but allowing the people responsible for my injuries and my teammates' deaths to escape accountability. The decision would ultimately be made for me when Major Hamilton returned with new evidence that connected the corruption directly to my family's military network. The investigation had uncovered financial transfers between accounts controlled by personnel at Fort Braxton and the compromised soldiers in my unit. The web of betrayal was larger and more personal than I had ever imagined, and my testimony had become essential to understanding its full scope. The battle for truth and justice was about to begin in earnest, and I was no longer just a victim of the corruption. I was becoming its primary witness and most vulnerable target. The turning point came when Major Hamilton presented me with a classified document that made my blood run cold. It was a financial transaction record showing a wire transfer of $75,000 from an account registered to Torres Family Trust to a shell company that had been traced back to Staff Sergeant Murphy. The transfer had occurred just 3 days before our convoy's fateful mission, timing that was far too coincidental to ignore. The battle for truth and justice was about to begin in earnest, and I was no longer just a victim of the corruption. I was becoming its primary witness and most vulnerable target. The turning point came when Major Hamilton presented me with a classified document that made my blood run cold. It was a financial transaction record showing a wire transfer of $75,000 from an account registered to Torres Family Trust to a shell company that had been traced back to Staff Sergeant Murphy. The transfer had occurred just 3 days before our convoy's fateful mission, timing that was far too coincidental to ignore. Major Hamilton's expression was carefully neutral as she explained the document's significance. The Torres Family Trust had been established by my parents as a retirement investment fund, drawing contributions from both their military salaries and my father's consulting work with defense contractors. What made the transfer suspicious wasn't just the amount or timing, but the fact that it represented the first transaction the trust had ever made to an entity outside traditional financial institutions. My hands trembled as I examined the documentation. There, in official bank records, was my mother's electronic signature authorizing the transfer. The memo line read, "Equipment Purchase Authorization," with a reference number that didn't correspond to any legitimate military procurement system. The evidence was damning, but I struggled to accept what it implied about my own family's involvement in the corruption that had nearly killed me. Major Hamilton's questioning became more intense as she walked me through the timeline. According to her investigation, the Torres Family Trust had received unusual deposits over the past 18 months, totaling nearly $300,000 beyond what my parents' military salaries could justify. The deposits had come from multiple sources, including defense contractors, private security firms, and offshore accounts that investigators were still trying to trace. The pattern suggested a sophisticated money laundering operation designed to hide payments for classified information and military equipment. My parents weren't just passively involved, they appeared to be central figures in a network that spanned multiple military installations and involved dozens of personnel across different branches of service. As Major Hamilton continued her presentation, I learned that my brother David's unit had also been compromised. Equipment shortages and intelligence leaks in his area of operations had resulted in 3 separate attacks on American forces over the past year. The investigation had identified financial connections between the Torres Family Trust and personnel in David's unit, suggesting that the corruption extended directly to my brother's operational environment. The revelation about David hit me hardest of all. My older brother had been my hero throughout childhood, the perfect soldier who embodied everything noble about military service. The possibility that he might be involved in activities that endangered his own troops was almost impossible to process. Yet the evidence was mounting that the entire Torres family legacy was built on a foundation of betrayal and greed. Major Hamilton's most devastating revelation came last. She presented me with intercepted communications between my mother and an unidentified contact dated just 2 days after my injury. In the messages, my mother discussed the need to manage the situation and ensure that family interests remained protected. She specifically mentioned concerns about my emotional state and the possibility that I might compromise operational security if I became too involved with investigators. The messages made it clear that my mother's harsh response to my emotional breakdown hadn't been about military bearing or family tradition. It had been a calculated attempt to discredit my reliability as a potential witness. By establishing that I was emotionally unstable and prone to excessive reactions, she was trying to undermine any testimony I might provide about the corruption within my unit. Reading those messages, I finally understood the true depth of my family's betrayal. My mother hadn't been trying to make me stronger or uphold military traditions. She had been protecting a criminal enterprise that had cost American lives, including nearly my own. Her coldness during my recovery wasn't misguided parental discipline. It was damage control designed to preserve her criminal network. Major Hamilton explained that my cooperation with the investigation was no longer optional. The evidence directly implicated my family in activities that constituted treason, conspiracy, and multiple violations of military justice. As a material witness with direct knowledge of the affected operations, I would be required to provide testimony regardless of my personal feelings about the consequences. However, she also offered me an opportunity that could change everything. If I was willing to actively cooperate with the investigation by wearing recording devices and attempting to gather additional evidence during family communications, the military justice system would consider my assistance when determining my own culpability. The investigators believed I was an unwitting victim rather than a willing participant, but my continued cooperation would be essential to proving that assessment. The proposal was terrifying. Actively working against my own family went against every instinct I had developed throughout my life. Despite everything I had learned, these were still the people who had raised me, supported my military career, and celebrated my achievements. The thought of secretly recording conversations with my parents felt like a fundamental violation of family bonds that had already been severely damaged. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the fact that their criminal activities had directly contributed to the attack that killed 3 of my fellow soldiers. The same corruption that had endangered my life was continuing to put other American service members at risk. If I remained silent or uncooperative, more soldiers would die while my family profited from their betrayal. The decision became more urgent when I received another call from home. This time, my mother was calling to inform me that she had arranged for my medical transfer to Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland. She explained that the transfer would provide better rehabilitation services and allow the family to visit more frequently during my recovery. However, Major Hamilton had already warned me that my mother's real motivation was to remove me from the investigation's sphere of influence. Once I was transferred to a different command structure, it would become much more difficult for Afghan-based investigators to access my testimony. The transfer was another attempt to obstruct justice while appearing to provide parental care. During the call, I made my first attempt at gathering evidence by asking direct questions about my family's financial situation. My mother's responses were evasive and defensive, suggesting that she suspected my motivations. However, she did confirm that my father had been doing consulting work for defense contractors and that the family's investment portfolio had been performing exceptionally well in recent years. Most revealing was her advice about my interactions with investigators. She strongly urged me to limit my cooperation to basic factual responses and to avoid speculation about unit operations or personnel behavior. She specifically warned me against trusting outsiders who might use my testimony for political purposes that could damage military morale and effectiveness. The conversation reinforced my growing understanding that my family saw me as a potential threat rather than a beloved daughter. Their concern wasn't about my physical or emotional recovery, it was about controlling the information I might share with people who were investigating their criminal activities. After hanging up, I made the decision that would define the rest of my military career and my relationship with my family. I agreed to Major Hamilton's proposal to actively cooperate with the investigation by gathering additional evidence through recorded family communications. The choice felt like a betrayal of everything I had been taught about loyalty and family bonds, but I could no longer ignore the fact that my family had already betrayed far more fundamental principles. The recording equipment was sophisticated but discreet, allowing me to capture both voice conversations and electronic communications without detection. Major Hamilton's team provided extensive training on legal protocols and evidence-gathering procedures to ensure that anything I collected would be admissible in court-martial proceedings. As I prepared for my next family contact, I realized that I was no longer just recovering from combat injuries. I was preparing to wage war against the people who had raised me, using the very military training they had encouraged me to pursue. The irony was bitter, but the necessity was undeniable. The battle for truth and justice was about to become personal in ways I had never imagined possible. The first recorded conversation with my family revealed more than Major Hamilton's team had anticipated. Using a secure video call setup that appeared routine for a recovering soldier, I initiated contact with both my parents simultaneously. The recording equipment captured not only their words, but also subtle background conversations and environmental details that proved crucial to understanding their operation's scope. My father appeared unusually nervous during the call, frequently checking his watch and glancing at something off camera. When I casually mentioned that the investigation into our unit was expanding, his reaction was immediate and telling. He caught me off mid-sentence and suggested we discuss family matters instead of work-related issues. The abrupt subject change confirmed that my parents were actively monitoring their communications for potential security breaches. My mother's behavior was more calculated but equally revealing. She steered the conversation toward my medical transfer arrangements, providing specific details about transportation, timing, and personnel assignments that she shouldn't have had access to through normal channels. Her knowledge suggested either high-level connections within the medical command structure or unauthorized access to classified patient information. Most damaging was an unguarded moment when my father received what appeared to be an urgent phone call during our video session. Although he attempted to mute his audio, the recording equipment captured fragments of his conversation with an unidentified caller. The partial dialogue included references to package delivery schedules, payment confirmations, and security protocols that bore no resemblance to legitimate military or business communications. The evidence gathered from that single conversation provided investigators with new leads that expanded the case beyond anything they had previously imagined. Financial forensics teams traced the payment confirmations referenced to a series of cryptocurrency transactions involving accounts linked to known terrorist financing networks. The package delivery schedules corresponded to documented equipment thefts from multiple military installations across the Middle East. Major Hamilton's briefing on the conversation's implications was sobering. The investigation had evolved from a localized corruption case into a national security matter involving international terrorism and weapons trafficking. My family wasn't just profiting from military equipment sales, they were actively supporting organizations that were killing American soldiers and civilians. The scope of the criminal enterprise became clearer as investigators analyzed financial records and communication patterns. The Torres Family Trust was functioning as a money laundering operation for a network that included defense contractors, military personnel, and foreign intelligence services.
The conspiracy had been operating for at least 3 years and had generated millions of dollars in illegal profits while compromising dozens of military operations. My brother David's situation proved more complex than initially suspected. According to intelligence gathered through the investigation, David had been recruited into the conspiracy through financial pressure rather than ideological motivation. Gambling debts and failed investments had made him vulnerable to blackmail, leading to his cooperation with equipment theft and intelligence sharing. However, evidence suggested he had been attempting to extricate himself from the network in the months before my injury. This revelation provided a potential opportunity for the investigation. If David could be convinced to cooperate with authorities, his testimony could provide crucial evidence about the conspiracy's operations and leadership structure. Major Hamilton proposed that I attempt to contact David directly, using our sibling relationship to assess his willingness to cooperate and potentially gather evidence about his handlers. The plan to contact David required careful coordination with his commanding officers and communication security protocols. Military investigators had to ensure that our contact wouldn't compromise ongoing operations in his area or alert other conspiracy members to the investigation's progress. After several days of preparation, a secure communication channel was established that would allow us to speak privately while maintaining operational security. David's reaction when I finally reached him was immediately emotional. He broke down crying as soon as he heard my voice, expressing guilt and remorse that went far beyond normal sibling concern about my injuries. Through his tears, he confessed that he had been aware of security breaches in his unit, but had been too afraid to report them because of his own involvement in related activities. The recorded conversation with David provided the most comprehensive evidence the investigation had gathered. He detailed a recruitment process that targeted financially vulnerable soldiers through gambling operations, loan schemes, and investment fraud. Once soldiers were indebted to the network, they were gradually introduced to increasingly serious criminal activities, starting with minor equipment theft and progressing to intelligence sharing and operational planning assistance.
David's description of the network's leadership structure was particularly valuable. He identified my father as a key coordinator who used his position at Fort Braxton to recruit new participants and facilitate equipment transfers. My mother's role was more strategic, using her military connections and security clearances to obtain operational intelligence that was sold to hostile forces. Most shocking was David's revelation about the timing of my deployment to Afghanistan. According to his information, my assignment to the compromised medical unit hadn't been coincidental. My parents had specifically requested my placement in that unit to provide additional intelligence access and to create leverage over my potential testimony if the network was ever discovered. The realization that my family had deliberately placed me in danger to protect their criminal enterprise was devastating. They had knowingly assigned me to a unit they knew was compromised, accepting the risk to my life as an acceptable cost of maintaining their operations' security. The attack that had nearly killed me wasn't just a consequence of their betrayal, it was a foreseeable result of their calculated decision-making. David's cooperation with the investigation accelerated dramatically after our conversation. He provided detailed financial records, communication logs, and operational documents that had been hidden in various locations across his deployment area. His evidence confirmed the network's international connections and revealed previously unknown participants in multiple branches of the military. The investigation team used David's information to coordinate simultaneous raids on network facilities across 3 continents. The operation, codenamed Broken Shield, resulted in the arrest of 47 military personnel, 32 defense contractors, and dozens of foreign nationals involved in the conspiracy. The seized evidence included millions of dollars in cash, weapons, equipment, and classified documents that had been stolen from American forces. My parents' arrest came on a Tuesday morning while I was undergoing physical therapy at Bagram. Major Hamilton personally delivered the news, explaining that both had been taken into custody at Fort Braxton during the coordinated raids. They were being held on charges including treason, conspiracy to commit murder, weapons trafficking, and violation of the Espionage Act. The arrests generated immediate media attention that threatened to overwhelm the investigation's careful security protocols.
News outlets reported on the Torres family conspiracy as one of the largest military corruption cases in modern history. My own role as a key witness became public knowledge, leading to both praise for my courage and criticism from military families who viewed my testimony as a betrayal of military loyalty. The public attention was overwhelming and frightening. I received hundreds of messages from strangers, ranging from supportive encouragement to death threats from people who believed I had destroyed an honorable military family for personal gain. The military provided security protection, but the constant scrutiny made my recovery process significantly more difficult. Most painful was the silence from extended family members and family friends, who had previously been supportive. The Torres name, which had once opened doors and generated respect, now carried connotations of betrayal and criminality. I found myself isolated not only from my immediate family, but from the entire military community that had shaped my identity. However, support came from unexpected sources. Fellow soldiers who had served in compromised units reached out to share their own experiences with equipment shortages and suspicious activities. Military families who had lost loved ones in attacks potentially connected to the conspiracy expressed gratitude for my courage in exposing the truth. The investigation's success had come at an enormous personal cost, but it had also prevented additional attacks and saved countless lives. As I prepared for the court-martial proceedings that would determine my family's fate, I realized that my definition of military service and family loyalty had been fundamentally transformed by the experience.
The battle for truth and justice was entering its final phase, but the war for my own identity and future was just beginning. The court-martial proceedings began 6 months after my parents' arrest, held at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. I had been medically transferred to Walter Reed as originally planned, but now under protective custody rather than family care. The irony wasn't lost on me that my mother's manipulation had inadvertently placed me in the exact location where I would be safest during the trial. The prosecution team, led by Colonel Janet Richardson, had built what they called an airtight case against the conspiracy members. However, they warned me that the defense strategy would focus heavily on discrediting my testimony by portraying me as an emotionally unstable soldier seeking revenge against my family. My mother's documented comments about my emotional breakdown would be central to their attack on my credibility. Preparing for testimony required weeks of intensive coaching with military lawyers and FBI specialists. They helped me understand that effective testimony meant presenting facts clearly and calmly, regardless of the emotional impact of discussing my family's betrayal. The preparation sessions were grueling, forcing me to relive the most painful moments of my experience while maintaining the composure that my mother had once demanded. The media circus surrounding the trial was unlike anything in recent military justice history. Security at the courthouse was unprecedented, with protesters on both sides creating a volatile atmosphere. Some demonstrators supported my courage in exposing military corruption, while others viewed me as a traitor who had destroyed an honorable family for personal gain. The division in public opinion reflected the complexity of the case and the conflicted feelings many Americans had about military loyalty versus accountability. My first day of testimony began with the prosecution establishing my military background and the circumstances that had led to my involvement in the investigation. Colonel Richardson's questions were methodical and professional, designed to present me as a credible witness who had acted from duty rather than personal motivation. She carefully walked through my service record, my injuries, and my initial cooperation with investigators. The defense attorney representing my parents, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Stevens, was aggressive from the moment cross-examination began. He immediately challenged my mental state following the convoy attack, introducing medical records that documented my emotional distress and questioning whether trauma had affected my perception of events. His strategy was to suggest that my accusations against my family were the product of brain injury and psychological instability rather than actual evidence. Stevens' most damaging line of attack focused on my decision to secretly record family conversations. He portrayed this as a fundamental betrayal of trust that demonstrated my unreliability and vindictive nature. During particularly intense questioning, he suggested that I had fabricated or misinterpreted conversations to support my accusations against my parents.
The emotional toll of being attacked by the defense while discussing my family's betrayal was overwhelming. At one point during cross-examination, I broke down crying while describing my mother's reaction to my injuries. Stevens immediately seized on this emotional display, asking if this was the kind of unstable behavior that had characterized my interactions with my family throughout my recovery. Colonel Richardson's objections stopped the line of questioning, but the damage was done. Stevens had successfully demonstrated that discussing my family's actions still caused me significant emotional distress, potentially undermining my credibility with the military jury. The defense strategy was working exactly as my mother had originally planned when she first criticized my emotional response to trauma. However, the prosecution's case was strengthened significantly when David took the stand as a cooperating witness. David's testimony provided detailed corroboration of my accusations and offered insight into the conspiracy's operations that I couldn't have possessed. David's obvious remorse and his cooperation with the investigation lent credibility to our family's victims rather than its perpetrators.
David's testimony revealed additional details about our parents' criminal activities that hadn't been disclosed during the investigation phase. He described witnessing conversations between our mother and foreign contacts who were clearly intelligence operatives from hostile nations. He provided specific examples of classified information that our father had shared with conspiracy members, directly leading to successful attacks on American forces. Most damaging to the defense was David's testimony about our parents' reaction to my injury. According to his account, our mother had expressed relief that the convoy attack had occurred because it provided an opportunity to neutralize my potential as a witness. Our father had suggested that my injuries might be severe enough to prevent me from providing coherent testimony, viewing my trauma as beneficial to their legal defense. The prosecution also presented Specialist Jordan Price, whose technical testimony about the intercepted communications provided objective evidence that couldn't be challenged through emotional manipulation. Jordan's detailed analysis of radio transmissions and encryption protocols demonstrated the sophisticated nature of the intelligence sharing that had enabled the attack on our convoy. Perhaps the most powerful witness was Dr. Amanda Foster, the civilian contractor who had worked with our medical unit in Afghanistan. Her testimony focused on the missing medical supplies and equipment that had compromised our ability to treat casualties during and after the convoy attack. She described specific instances where life-saving medications and equipment that should have been available were nowhere to be found when critically needed. Dr. Foster's professional assessment was that the missing supplies had directly contributed to preventable deaths among American soldiers. Her testimony established that the conspiracy's activities weren't abstract crimes against military regulations. They were concrete actions that had cost lives and increased suffering among wounded service members. The defense's strategy shifted as the prosecution's case strengthened. Rather than denying the conspiracy's existence, they began arguing that my parents had been coerced into participation by threats against their children's safety. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens presented evidence suggesting that David's gambling debts had been deliberately created by hostile intelligence services to create leverage over the entire family. This coercion defense required the defense to acknowledge that criminal activities had occurred while arguing that my parents were victims rather than willing participants. Stevens presented communications that he claimed showed my parents attempting to withdraw from the conspiracy after learning about potential dangers to their children's military service. However, the prosecution effectively countered this defense by presenting financial evidence showing that my parents had profited substantially from their participation. The Torres Family Trust had grown by hundreds of thousands of dollars through conspiracy-related activities, suggesting willing participation rather than reluctant coercion. Colonel Richardson argued that any attempts to withdraw had been motivated by fear of discovery rather than moral concerns. The trial's most dramatic moment came when my mother took the stand in her own defense. Her testimony was carefully rehearsed and presented her as a dedicated military officer who had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminal organizations. She maintained her military bearing throughout, presenting herself as the disciplined soldier she had always claimed to be. However, her testimony about our relationship and her reaction to my injuries revealed the cold calculation that had characterized her approach to the investigation. When questioned about her harsh response to my emotional breakdown, she maintained that military discipline required emotional control even during medical recovery. She showed no recognition that her response had been inappropriate or hurtful. Most telling was her testimony about the secretly recorded conversations. She expressed outrage at my betrayal of family trust, describing my cooperation with investigators as a fundamental violation of family loyalty. Her anger was genuine and intense, revealing the depth of her belief that family loyalty should supersede legal and moral obligations. The prosecution's final witness was Major Hamilton, who provided a comprehensive overview of the investigation's findings and the conspiracy's impact on military operations. Her professional assessment was that the Torres family network had been responsible for compromising dozens of military operations and contributing to the deaths of at least 15 American service members. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, I realized that the outcome would determine not only my parents' fate, but also the future of military accountability and family loyalty. The case had become a symbol of larger questions about duty, honor, and the cost of speaking truth to power within military institutions. The weight of those expectations was almost as heavy as the personal cost of pursuing justice against my own family. The closing arguments began on a Friday morning in early November, exactly 1 year after the convoy attack that had started this entire ordeal. Colonel Richardson's summation was methodical and devastating, walking the jury through each piece of evidence that demonstrated my parents' central role in a conspiracy that had cost American lives and compromised national security. She began by addressing the defense's attacks on my credibility, pointing out that every major element of my testimony had been corroborated by independent evidence. The financial records, communication intercepts, and witness statements all supported my account of events, regardless of any emotional trauma I had experienced. Richardson emphasized that questioning my mental state didn't change the objective facts that had been presented throughout the trial. The prosecution's most powerful moment came when Richardson displayed photographs of the soldiers who had died in attacks connected to the conspiracy. She read their names aloud, along with details about their families and military service, personalizing the cost of the criminal activities. The courtroom fell silent as she explained how each death could be traced back to intelligence or equipment that had been compromised by network members. Richardson's final argument focused on the concept of military honor and the oath that all service members take to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She argued that my parents had become domestic enemies of the United States through their willing participation in activities that aided hostile forces. Their military service, rather than excusing their actions, made their betrayal more heinous because they had violated the sacred trust placed in them by their fellow soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens' closing argument for the defense was equally passionate, but focused on humanizing my parents rather than justifying their actions. He acknowledged that crimes had been committed, but argued that the evidence showed my parents had been manipulated and coerced by more sophisticated criminal organizations. Stevens painted them as patriots who had been trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The defense's most effective argument centered on the complexity of modern military operations and the difficulty of distinguishing between legitimate intelligence sharing and criminal activity. Stevens suggested that my parents had believed they were participating in authorized activities and had only realized the true nature of the conspiracy when it was too late to withdraw safely. However, Stevens' argument was undermined by the financial evidence showing substantial profits from the conspiracy. His explanation that the money had been accepted reluctantly as part of maintaining their cover was unconvincing, given the amounts involved and the family's use of the funds for personal investments and expenditures. The jury deliberated for 3 days, during which I remained in protective custody at Walter Reed. The waiting was agonizing, made worse by continued media coverage speculating about the potential verdict and its implications for military justice. Legal experts debated whether the case would set new precedents for prosecuting military corruption or whether the family dynamics would generate sympathy for the defendants. During the deliberation period, I received an unexpected visit from Rebecca, my younger sister, who had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal.
Now 18 and preparing for her planned enrollment at West Point, she appeared older and more serious than I remembered. Her visit was the first direct contact I had with any family member since the arrests. Rebecca's conversation was hesitant and emotional, reflecting the impossible position she had been placed in by our family's circumstances. She explained that she had been living with our aunt while finishing high school, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while dealing with the shame and confusion of our parents' charges. Her West Point appointment had been suspended pending the trial's outcome, leaving her future as uncertain as my own.
Most importantly, Rebecca expressed her support for my decision to cooperate with the investigation. She had gradually come to understand that my testimony wasn't a betrayal of family, but an affirmation of the military values that our parents had claimed to represent. Her validation meant more to me than any legal vindication could provide. Rebecca also shared information about our extended family's reactions to the trial. Most had initially supported our parents, viewing the charges as unfair targeting of a distinguished military family. However, as evidence mounted and details emerged, many relatives had begun to reconsider their positions. The family was fracturing along lines of loyalty versus justice, creating divisions that would likely persist for generations. The verdict came on a Tuesday afternoon. The military jury had reached unanimous decisions on all charges against both parents. As the verdicts were read aloud, the courtroom remained completely silent except for the judge's voice announcing each finding. My mother was found guilty on all counts: treason, conspiracy to commit murder, violation of the Espionage Act, and multiple counts of theft of military property. The jury had rejected the defense's coercion argument, concluding that her actions were knowing and willing. The evidence of her leadership role in the conspiracy had been too overwhelming to dismiss. My father received similar convictions, though the jury found him guilty of lesser charges related to his supporting role rather than leadership position. The distinction was meaningful legally, but had little practical impact given the severity of the crimes involved. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but military prosecutors had already indicated they would seek life imprisonment without possibility of parole for both defendants. The charges carried potential death penalty provisions, but the prosecution had agreed not to pursue capital punishment in exchange for my cooperation and David's testimony. The immediate aftermath of the verdicts was surreal. Media coverage was extensive, with commentators debating whether justice had been served or whether family loyalty had been sacrificed for institutional protection. Public opinion remained divided, though polls suggested that most Americans supported the convictions despite sympathy for the family dynamics involved. For me personally, the verdicts brought relief rather than satisfaction. The legal validation of my testimony resolved questions about my credibility and mental state, but it couldn't restore the family relationships that had been destroyed by the truth. I had chosen justice over loyalty, and while that choice had been morally necessary, its personal cost would be permanent. The months following the trial brought unexpected opportunities alongside continued challenges. My testimony had generated interest from military reform advocates who wanted to strengthen oversight of defense contracting and intelligence operations. I was invited to speak at congressional hearings about improving security protocols and preventing similar conspiracies. My military career officially ended with a medical retirement due to my combat injuries, but I was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for my role in exposing the conspiracy. The citation recognized my courage in placing duty and honor above personal interests, language that would have made my mother proud under different circumstances. The financial restitution from the conspiracy's seized assets provided some compensation for victims' families and compromised military operations. However, no amount of money could restore the lives lost or the trust betrayed by those who were supposed to protect American interests. 3 years after the convoy attack, I work as a consultant for military accountability organizations and speak regularly about ethics and integrity in military service. The work is meaningful and allows me to channel my experience into preventing similar betrayals. I have found purpose in advocating for the values that military service should represent.
Rebecca eventually received her West Point appointment after demonstrating that she had not been involved in our parents' activities. She visits occasionally, and we are slowly rebuilding a relationship based on shared values rather than family loyalty. David completed his service honorably after his cooperation with the investigation and now works in civilian security consulting. My parents remain imprisoned, their appeals having been exhausted after multiple court reviews. I have not spoken to them since the trial, and I do not expect that situation to change. They represent a part of my life that ended when my mother chose military image over maternal compassion during my darkest hour. The convoy attack that nearly killed me ultimately saved my life by revealing truths that needed to be exposed. My mother was wrong about soldiers not crying. Sometimes tears are the most honest response to betrayal and loss. But she was also wrong about what makes a soldier strong. True strength comes from choosing duty and honor even when they conflict with personal loyalty and family bonds. The military taught me that some battles must be fought regardless of their personal cost. Standing up for truth and justice, even against your own family, represents the highest form of military service. That lesson, more than any medal or commendation, defines what it means to be a soldier worthy of the uniform. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.